The last few days at West Ham have been intriguing, to say the least. Intriguing because David Moyes and the announcement that he made in his press conference on Friday regarding his contractual situation seemed, I don't know, bizarre, interesting, intriguing because we've grown accustomed to David Moyes being extremely coy in press meetings. He hardly ever really sort of wants to give anything away. He rarely wants to give any information about player updates, etc., or updates about himself. So to hear him be so open about the status of his contract was somewhat surprising. So, was it posturing from David Moyes? Was everything he said about his contractual situation true? And I guess in order to determine whether he was being factual about an offer that may or may not have been made, we need to understand what the West Ham board think of David Moyes. And when I say the board, I don't necessarily mean Daniel Kretinsky or Trip Smith, or even to some extent Vanessa Gold, but more specifically, what Karen Brady and David Sullivan think of the manager. You see, they're the ones that are most likely to decide on David Moyes' future more than the other directors or shareholders of the club. And it's not because the likes of Kretinsky or Gold or Trip Smith don't care about West Ham. But over the years, we've become more accustomed or acclimatized to knowing that when it comes to things like hiring and firing a manager, it's more down to David Gold and Karen Brady above and beyond any of the other shareholders or directors at the club. And I guess that is quite a big thing because both Brady and Sullivan are big admirers of David Moyes. And they've demonstrated that over time throughout the years. You've only got to go back just 5 months ago where Karen Brady was on Talk Sport and she was talking about David Moyes. And she said, David Moyes is a class act, both on and off the pitch. Moyes' ambitions are all for West Ham, and he's a joy to work with. Now, Karen Brady has got nothing but respect for David Moyes, obviously, for what he's done at the club over the time that he's been at the helm. You go back even further to March of last year when we were in a relegation battle, and Brady said the following during a BBC Radio London interview. She said, I can't put any pressure on David Moyes because he puts enough of that on himself. The really important thing is for everyone to stick together, to be really focused and understand what the issues are. It's been a disappointing season so far. After 2 great seasons and the successes that we had in Europe, things haven't gone the way we wanted. We spent an extraordinarily amount of money in the summer of 2022. Undoubtedly, it takes time for people to settle and create a new way of playing with such a lot of new players. So you could see by that statement, Brady was suggesting that Moyes is doing his best. And so if Brady was backing David Moyes when we were fighting relegation last season, it's highly unlikely she's going to be against David Moyes when we're in a much healthier position in the league this season, as well as still competing for Europe. You see, success means something very different to the board than it does to the West Ham fan base. And to be honest, I get it. We as fans, we live and breathe West Ham United. And as the old saying goes, being a West Ham fan is in our blood. So when we win, when we lose or draw, it affects us far more than anyone else. The team and its successes or failures means more to the fan base than it does to, say, pundits or opposition fans, and rightly so. A defeat and a poor performance can often put us in a foul mood and a miserable mood for the week ahead, or until the next game when we hope that that next performance and the result is going to improve so that we can return to our happy place. But when the performances continue to be bad and the results continue to go against us, I guess the dark mood some fans often feel, begins to take over our lives. And that then becomes a vent. And then that becomes anger. And it starts to engulf us. And before we know it, we're demanding for change. So when we hear pundits or opposition fans asking us what it is we're upset about, it's because they don't feel that anger. They don't feel that dark mood in the way that we do. Pundits might try and qualify some of the performances, and results by saying things like West Ham are on a poor run of form at the moment, because they would probably believe that this poor run is only momentary and not going to last long term. Now, what I've just said doesn't mean that just because the fans feel so passionately, the board don't care. I think the board do care. They care because from a business perspective, the higher up the league we finish, the more money we earn from it. The longer we stay in Europe, the bigger the prestige of the club becomes, which leads to us being able to target better players in the transfer market, which ultimately, or should ultimately, lead to even more success and even better players coming to West Ham. So for the board, it's a cycle over the long term rather than just, say, for part of a season. So when we as fans lose it over Moyes' tactics, his team selection, his playing style, the board look at the situation in a very different way, and they'll be asking very different questions to what the fans are asking. They'll be asking things like, where are we likely to end at the end of this season, rather than where are we at the end of each game? Now, look, I've no doubt at all that if we get knocked out of Europe and don't qualify for it next season, that will obviously have an impact on what the board may do. But the board won't decide on David Moyes' future purely because of our playing style and because we may not qualify in Europe for the fourth season in a row. If we were to end up dropping like a stone into the relegation zone, which is highly unlikely given our current points tally, then perhaps the board are likely to have a very different conversation with David Moyes at the end of this season. However, if we start to gain points and finish in a reasonable position in the league, and reasonable is likely to mean top half, even if we don't qualify for Europe, then the board may consider that to be a reasonably successful season and one that we can build on in the future. Granted, if we're out of Europe, we may not get another Kudus or Paqueta in the transfer market, but we'll still get good enough players to help us try and qualify for Europe the following season. And if you doubt that, then go back to the squads that we've had over the last few years to remind yourselves of what we had in those squads who got us into Europe in the first place. Then we also have to consider our previous managers under the current ownership, and one can hardly call any of them a real success. All right, I know West Ham United came in midway through a season when Gianfranco Zola was here, but he only just finished one place above relegation zone in the season that they took over the club. And then, of course, we had the absolute disaster of Avram Grant, who didn't avoid relegation, got us relegated in the one and only season that he was here at West Ham. And then, of course, we went into the Sam Allardyce era. All right, there was success getting us back into the through the playoffs into the Premier League, but with the squad we had, we should have just got back into the Premier League automatically. And the best thing that we got under Allardyce in the years that he was here was 10th in the league. And then, of course, we got Slaven Bilic, and there was a creditable level of success under him. We finished 7th in the last season of at the Bowling, but that was the best that Slaven Bilic brought to the club. Then after that, a brief spell with David Moyes, of course, when we sacked Bilic, and then we went into the Pellegrini era, didn't we? And with all the money that was spent under Manuel Pellegrini, even he only managed to get us to 10th in the league. And then, of course, the following season, we were suffering yet another relegation battle. And yet again, David Moyes was brought in order to try and keep us in the league, which he did. And then things took off from there, didn't it? We all know since then, we finished 6th in the league, 7th in the league, qualified for Europe for 3 seasons in a row, as well as having won our first trophy for over 40 odd years. So when it comes to the board, it's quite understandable why they might deem David Moyes as a safe pair of hands and someone who, after so many false dawns under other managers, has brought stability to the club, he's brought progress, and he's brought success to West Ham United. And that takes me back to the comments David Moyes made in his press conference on Friday. When he said he's had discussions with Karen Brady and David Sullivan about his contract, I believe him. I believe there have been conversations about a future contract. When he says there's a contract there for him to sign and that he wants to wait until the end of the season, I'm leaning towards perhaps not believing that 100%. I still think there are other factors involved as to whether Moyes stays on as manager beyond this season or not. And one of those factors will include our transfer business in the future and what role the likes of Tim Steidten and, equally as importantly, the likes of Maximilian Hahn will have on transfers. As you know, Tim Steidten has brought Maximilian Hahn to look at the way we do our transfer business. He's going to bring a data analysis type of approach to transfers in the future. So Moyes knows that the way he personally scouts players in the past, going to watch them probably several times over, is not a thing for the future. He knows the new ways of scouting are initiated now by data-driven analysis, which will become more prominent in the process of bringing players in. And Moyes also knows that by doing that, he's less likely to be able to get Premier League proven experienced players that he prefers. And sometimes we're going to have to take calculated risks on players who are younger and are less experienced in the Premier League than Moyes would like. But then that's what the data-driven analysis is for, is to mitigate the risks as best as possible. And after all, you've got to remember, Moyes has personally scouted players in the past, which not all have been a roaring success. If Moyes is going to accept that new way to recruit players as part of his new deal, that Steidten and his backroom staff are going to have more say in who we bring in to West Ham United, then it's possible that Moyes' tenure at the club could be extended. But Moyes is a proud man, and we all know that, and he's a traditional manager as well. And if he doesn't accept that Tim Steidten and his backroom staff will have a say in transfers, then it's very possible that Moyes will indeed decide not to accept the new contract that may be on the table. But that aside, there is another element to all of this as well. And in his press conference, Moyes said, the club has offered me a new contract, but we are in a position where we'd rather wait. I want it to be right for the club, and I want it to be right for me and my family. And it is the latter part of that statement that could eventually determine whether David Moyes really stays at West Ham United or not. Whilst he himself is likely to have a thick skin and try not to let the bitter and personal attacks against him that have been aimed at him for much of the last season and a half or so, he may not be affected by it, but it may impact on his family in a very different way. And that will probably be a massive thing for David Moyes to consider. Look, no matter what walk of life you're in, whatever job you do, when you and your family hear constant negativity, sometimes abusive, those sorts of comments thrown at you on a daily basis, even if you as an individual might be able to shrug it off and move on, close family members may not be able to ignore that in the same way. And if David Moyes agrees to all the footballing terms of this new contract, and if the new contract is still on the table at the end of this season, if we get ourselves back on track, of course, I believe it will be David Moyes who might decide to accept it or not. If he does step away from West Ham United, it's more likely because he's deemed that the negative abuse he personally gets is not worth the damage it may cause to his family.